It's Tuesday, September 20th, 2016. This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. I'm Kenneth Arthur. With me, as always, is Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Gonna loop in as well the instant reaction podcast for Seaside Chats or Reel in the Field Goals. Didn't get to that this week, but we're going to talk about the Rams and the Seahawks. We're going to talk about the Seattle's loss 9-3 in Los Angeles in the first game in LA in 21 years. We're going to talk about the NFL rookies, and we'll talk about the 2017 NFL draft. As you know, not only do some players, rise up, others fall down, and we'll talk about potential number one picks. It's been a long considered a Deshaun Watson draft, but is that still the case after, a couple, 2-3 college games? And that's something we're going to get to as well. And why don't we start with the story of college football, which is Lamar Jackson and Louisville. They play Florida State and absolutely demolish number 2 Florida State. Does Louisville, with Lamar Jackson scoring another 5 touchdowns in that game. Rob, we've seen a lot of great college football players in the last few years. I mean, obviously, we've seen great college football players forever, since the beginning of college football in some respects. But, as far as dominating performances, we can talk about the Tim Tebows and the Johnny Manziels and the Leonard Fournettes and, but when I really think of like historically dominating, there's only maybe a few that come to mind. Barry Sanders at Oklahoma State. In your time in the last 10 years with what Lamar Jackson is doing at Louisville, does anything compare to this as far as Lamar Jackson, who has scored something like 18 touchdowns in 3 games as a quarterback, many of them on the ground? Does any player compare to dominance that we've seen from Lamar Jackson in your recent memory? And where does he now sort of rank as far as the 2018 NFL draft?
Well, there's not been anybody who's dominated like him in terms of production. I mean, nobody's got as many touchdowns as he has, and I don't think we've seen anybody that's quite as important to their team as he is. Because Louisville, that against Florida State, their defense played well, their special teams played well, and obviously the offense had a running game as well as just a quarterback. But he's just playing at a different level at the moment. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you're going to stop him, because he can beat you in so many ways. And you sort of see Lamar Jackson, he likes to take shots downfield. He's got a great arm. He sort of takes the inside zone run and can work through the interior and like a big running back. I mean, he's only a slight guy, and yet that inside zone run is incredible. He won't be able to do that at the next level, but at college it seems to work. He finds holes, he explodes to the second level, he's elusive at the second level. He's just such a weapon. Now, in terms of, players who have elevated their team to great heights almost single-handedly, I think the only sort of real comparison in recent times is Cam Newton, and the way that he emerged in one year and took Auburn to a national championship. They kind of came from nowhere. He came from nowhere, ended up being the number 1 overall pick in the draft, and he had a superb year. Now, I don't think you would compare Lamar Jackson as a prospect to Cam Newton. Newton had the size, a more orthodox style. Jackson's a bit of a weird one to work out in terms of the draft, because at the moment, I don't think his accuracy is that great. I think he throws with one pace, and it's kind of like balls on the table or nothing. He'll throw at 100 mile an hour on a 10-yard crossing route, and he'll throw at 100 miles an hour if he's launching it downfield on a 60-yard bomb. I mean, he doesn't really vary the pace. He doesn't throw with touch. And like I say, his accuracy has to improve. There's almost this sense of like, at the moment, he's just sort of flying by the seat of his pants. I mean, he's going into these games, and he seems to be having a lot of fun, doesn't seem to be feeling any of the pressure. He's kind of just playing backyard football. In 6 games' time, there'll be teams that might have worked. I think they get to play Clemson soon. They're going to be teams that will come up with a way that maybe just slows him down, or maybe he doesn't have things his own way in the first half, and then he's going to have to come back. A lot of his touchdowns have been in the first half of games. So if he doesn't have that early momentum, is he going to be able to keep that going? Is he going to be able to win a tight contest as opposed to blowouts, which is what they've had so far? He is a very interesting prospect. I have to say, I don't think that as a pro quarterback, he doesn't look at the moment like he's kind of got that necessarily in his future. I mean, I don't want to write the guy off. He doesn't look like a pro quarterback, but he's certainly got a pro future. I mean, you could see him playing receiver, you could see him playing cornerback, you could see him playing maybe even running back if he gets a little bigger. I don't know. Or just becoming a Percy Harvin style type of player. I'm not sure what he could be. Certainly, he has a pro future, and he's gone to Louisville to work with Bobby Petrino, essentially to be coached up to become a pro quarterback. He's still got a lot of time in his career. Let's see where he is in a year's time. But he's, without whatever happens with the NFL, he is the most exciting thing about college football right now, and he's making Louisville, appointment viewing, and they could easily get to the playoffs, and they could be a national champion contender here this year.
Yeah, Louisville ranked 3rd in the nation now after beating Florida State. They're 3-0, and they have a couple more big games coming up this season. Lamar Jackson is 50 of 82 for 913 yards, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. But he has rushed for 464 yards, which is 2nd in the nation. He has rushed for 9.5 yards per attempt, and he's rushed for 10 touchdowns, which is 1st in the nation by a very good margin. But some of that dynamic there that they have at Louisville underneath Bobby Petrino, running back Brandon Radcliffe has 27 carries for 296 yards and 11 touchdowns. So, not 11 touchdowns, 11 yards per carry. So their running back, Brandon Radcliffe, averaging 11 yards per carry. Their quarterback, Lamar Jackson, is 2nd in the nation in total yards and 1st in touchdowns. Is there anything there with Brandon Radcliffe? What kind of a prospect is he? And how much does the fact that they've got 2 guys averaging over 9 yards per carry factor into the fact that that there's the mutually beneficial, or a system, or the defense? How much of that do you take into account?
Yeah, I think you have to. And the running back's played really well so far. I mean, he's all power. He breaks tackles, gets to the second level. He's got decent speed. He looks like he could have a pro future as well. It's been quite fun to watch. And, you have to account for the quarterback every single time. I mean, when he is doing the read option, it's a little bit similar to the Seahawks. And this is one of the issues that they're having at the moment, is that because Wilson can't move, teams aren't necessarily respecting his ability to get out of the pocket or his ability to break off the run, and they can manage an offense a little easier because Lamar Jackson is such a threat, and he's a threat scrambling. He's a threat. You can round the edge and then break off a huge run. If he gets to the second level, he's a candidate to take it to the house every single time. And because teams have to respect that about him, it's creating this fantastic opportunity for the running back. There's only kind of half an eye on him, and he's really excelling here. And look, there's a couple of decent defensive ends at Louisville. There's a good running back. There's a good quarterback. There are 1 or 2 players there. Bobby Petrino is not everybody's cup of tea, but he's certainly done a decent job sort of getting the best out of that roster. And they're a team. I mean, they're not just a one-man team. They're being elevated to a national championship contender because of one player, but they're a team. And you don't destroy Florida State. Nobody's beaten Florida State like Louisville did at the weekend ever. So that is a win to take note. They were 2nd in the country, Florida State, when they went there and got shellacked by Louisville. So it'll be fun to see Louisville against Clemson. It'll be fun to see Louisville against Houston later in the year. They are going to be huge games.
I've got a 2017 NFL mock draft up here in front of me from CBS Sports, and I find it perhaps the most interesting thing about it, is that for a long time, all summer long, dating back to, Clemson's appearance in the national championship game last year, Deshaun Watson was going to be the number 1 pick, this quarterback who could do it all, running, throwing, all about the future of the NFL at the position of quarterback, which was mobility and being able to change offenses with the zone read, or just doing things that you couldn't normally do. And now in this CBS Sports, it's got the Cleveland Browns picking first. I've deemed that a team that desperately needs a quarterback. They'll be starting Cody Kessler this week. Amazingly enough, just signed Charlie Whitehurst, but they take Myles Garrett right here in this draft, which is, because they have the extra pick from Philadelphia, maybe a chance for them to pass on someone like Deshaun Watson. But it's not just the Deshaun Watson show anymore, as Deshaun Kaiser from Notre Dame is a quarterback that is suddenly moving up the boards very fastly. And this same draft, the same mock draft, has the Browns picking 9th from the Eagles, if that's going to be so the case for Philadelphia, and taking DeShone Kizer, therefore, getting their cake, getting to eat it at the same time. What are your thoughts on DeShone Kizer, and how do you rank the quarterbacks now into the 2017 NFL draft?
Well, for starters, if the Cleveland Browns think that they see a franchise quarterback in the top 10, they can't wait until the 9th overall pick to take them. They're going to have to take them with I also don't think they'll be picking twice in the top 10. I mean, anybody who watched Philadelphia last night will see that is a team that is incredibly well coached. I think that it was a good appointment, Doug Peterson, for them, because he comes from the Kansas City offense, which at the moment, it's a good. I mean, it's solid, and that's what I think Philly kind of needs right now. They need just a solid, well-coached offense. Carson Wentz has got a vast amount of experience in terms of the coaching and the coordinators, the QB coach, the head coach there. The defense with Jim Schwartz looked fantastic, albeit against a really bad opponent in Chicago. They've already got 2 wins, Philadelphia. I mean, that to finish in the top 10, they're probably going to need to be a 6 or 7 win team. And I think already they look like, they're going to be competing with the other teams in the NFC East there. So I can't see them picking twice in the top 10. What do I think of DeShone Kizer? Well, I thought the hype was a bit too much after the Texas game. I mean, he came into the season splitting snaps with Malik Zaire. So, if he was as good as advertised, if this was a future number 1 overall pick, if he was splitting snaps with another quarterback in the season opener, that wouldn't say much for the judgment of Brian Kelly and the Notre Dame staff there. That said, I watched him against Michigan State at the weekend, and I thought he looked pretty good. He looked better than he did I can't remember who they played in week 2, but his accuracy was a bit hit and miss in that game. He had a bad interception. I thought he looked a lot better against Michigan State. He's big, he's mobile, he can make all the plays that you want a quarterback to make. I thought that the way he carried the team back into that game, which it was a blowout at one point for Michigan State, and he dragged them back into it. I thought he looked really sharp. I watched an interview with him yesterday where he spoke really well, Kenny, and just sounds like a leader. And I'm not. There are people like Adam Schefter's already reported that DeShone Kizer is the future number 1 overall pick in this next draft. You have to you have to listen to stuff like that. But at the same time, I think there's still a lot of football to be played. And, can Kizer keep this up? Can he stay healthy? Deshaun Watson has been very consistent at Clemson, and I still think he's got a great chance of being the first quarterback taken. But, there are 2 guys with talent there, and we have to see who has the number 1 overall pick as to whether a quarterback will go there. Myles Garrett is great. I'm looking at the mock draft that you've just been looking at there, Kenny, and Leonard Fournette is the 8th player off the board. And I can see that in this mock draft, Juju Smith-Schuster and Jalen Tabor and Cam Robinson all go before Leonard Fournette. If that actually happens, I can't even think of what I would do. I'd be so shocked. It would be the single most shocking thing I think we've seen in draft history.
This is
to see those players go ahead of Fournette.
I think I lost your audio there for a second, but it's an interesting mock draft, and this is 3,000 NFL mock draft, and we could talk about the whole everything that surrounds mock drafts, and the fact that you pull one up, even one that seems to have the credibility of CBS behind it. They can be completely insane, and you don't really know what you're looking at until maybe you get that consensus and look at 10 to 12 mock drafts and see, like, is everybody saying this? Is this the one outlier? Maybe they're the right outliers. Not necessarily saying that just because you're the 1 out of 12 that has so and so going in a certain place that you're wrong. I know that Rob, you can yourself to attest to going against the grain with some players, especially at this stage of the college season, going against the grain with some players. And I think that, more often than not, you've been proven right with such as, Eli Apple going ahead of Vernon Hargreaves last year. Not something that, a lot of people had the attention to Sean Coleman and other players, I think that we'll see what happens in terms of the long term, in terms of Paxton Lynch and Jared Goff and Carson Wentz. But yeah, definitely it's hard to tell from just the one mock draft. But I did see more and more about DeShone Kizer. and where he gets to go. Though the headline reads as Browns pick DeShone Kizer, making you believe that he's the number one pick, when in fact they've decided to put him. And sometimes you massage these things in order to make them say what you want them to say. Moving on to Alabama and Ole Miss, the teams ranked first and 19th going into last week. A wild one as Alabama pulls out a 48-43 win. Ole Miss quarterback Chad Kelly, who could be a first-round pick next year, is 26 of 41 for 421 yards, 10.3 yards per attempt, and 3 touchdowns with one interception against Alabama, the number one team in the nation. It looks like you get that many yards and you get that many touchdowns. He also had 13 carries for 48 yards. Some movement there on the ground. You would think, like, what a good game for Chad Kelly, though I thought it was interesting that after the game, Rob Rang of CBS, fittingly enough, had said, that this was, if anything, this confirmed doubts about Chad Kelly and some of the flaws in his game, rather than, pump him up as being an even better choice in the first round next year. What were your thoughts?
I've never thought he was a first-round pick, and he reminds me a little bit of Connor Cook and the hype that was surrounding him. I mean, people were touting Connor Cook to be a first-round pick for 2 years, and he ended up going in the 4th round. And you sort of see some of the same issues with Chad Kelly. I mean, he makes some nice throws and he's capable of some decent throws and probably will go earlier than the 4th round. But first round, not for me. I mean, he makes too many mistakes. He will stare down his receivers so badly, and it leads to major turnovers. You just look at him and there's just nothing spectacular about his play. You don't think, wow, this is the guy that I'm going to rally behind. Now, I appreciate that. There are teams drafting guys like Christian Ponder in the first round, in the top 15, no less. So there's always likely to be one team. I mean, EJ Manuel went in the first round. There's always going to be one team who might pull off the surprise and invest in a guy like this. But, just watching him play the weekend and having watched him against Florida State as well, there is nothing about Chad Kelly that makes me think that he's going to go in the first frame.
What about some of these other players? Demoria Stringfellow is going to be, right at the top of the rankings in terms of names in next year's draft. Love the name Stringfellow. He tops it off with Demoria. I know that there were a few other guys that you liked in this game. And I think it's interesting, too, that, Bo Scarborough, who was, hyped up as a Heisman contender and the big follow-up to some of these great Alabama running backs, has 7 carries for 13 yards. Damian Harris has 16 carries for 144 yards. Quarterback Jalen Hurts has 18 carries for 146 yards. So they rushed for 334 yards on the ground. And excuse me if I have missed a story here or anything like that, but what is the story with Scarborough?
Well, at the moment, Alabama are just doing a running back by committee kind of approach. And I have to say, I've seen Alabama twice now, against USC and against Ole Miss. And, they look like a team that is in transition at the moment. They're starting a freshman quarterback who's feeling his way into it. The running back situation, for the first time in a while, there isn't anybody like Derrick Henry or Mark Ingram or Trent Richardson who is the lead back. They're rotating guys in and out. Bo Scarborough plays a bit, the other 2 guys play a bit. So I don't think that there's really anybody who's kind of snatched that role yet. They do have a really good receiver, Calvin Ridley, and the defense is playing really good as well. And Ole Miss did what they always do at the weekend, which is look promising for the first part of the game, getting to a winning position and then throw it away. So that's exactly what they did against Florida State as well. It will be on the tombstone of Hugh Freeze when he finishes his career that. This is a guy that flattered to deceive more than anybody else. That his teams do that. They've got so many good players, and yet they never quite put it together. I thought that the names you mentioned there, Stringfellow looked really, really good. I mean, I've never seen him look as good as he did at the weekend. I thought his body control was superb. Boxed out Marlon Humphrey on one play, which is not easy to do. Humphrey's a special player at cornerback. He made several other key plays. There was one great catch where Kelly's thrown it almost onto the turf and he's just got his fingers underneath it. It was initially called as a touchdown, but was then called back. He was like an inch off the line for a score. there was another run by Chad Kelly immediately after that on third down, where Kelly kind of scrambled to the right and then tried to dive for the end zone and fumbled the ball into the end zone. And Stringfellow was the most alert player on the field and dove down and landed on it. And a touchdown was given, recovered fumble for a touchdown for Stringfellow. And then on review, I think they decided that Kelly's knee was down or his arm was down or something. So they kicked the field goal instead. But, Stringfellow is not, I don't think he's going to sort of get into the first round kind of talk unless he continues what we saw at the weekend. But he's a really, really good player, and he's going to be of great value to somebody, maybe in that second and the third round. And then some of the other guys who impressed, I thought Marquise Haynes had another really good game, really productive guy, could be a Bruce Irvin type for a team like the Seahawks. Came up against Cam Robinson, and Robinson blocked him for the most part. Bear in mind that Robinson's got about 100 pounds on Marquise Haynes. He's about 225 rushing the edge. But there was a couple of occasions where Haynes physically just ragdolled Cam Robinson onto the turf, just threw him onto the turf. He's a strong guy despite his lack of size, and has got major, major production for Ole Miss. He's a really interesting sleeper type prospect who can be a pass rusher, can play some linebacker. Keep an eye on Marquise Haynes at Ole Miss. And then there was two others who really stood out. I thought Tim Williams, the edge rusher for Alabama, was superb, sensational. And Jonathan Allen had he's a big sort of DND tackle, Kenny. He's about 300 pounds. And he had a 75-yard interception return for a touchdown, which sums up how athletic he is. So it was a good day for Jonathan Allen and for Tim Williams for Alabama.
Just to remind fans, because there is so much talk about the running back class next year, and we can talk about, some of the leading rushers in FBS right now. We've talked about Lamar Jackson and his uncertain future in terms of an NFL career, but he's still got some time to go even before we can need to even start talking to that. Donnell Pumphrey is the leading rusher in the nation at San Diego State. He's got 599 yards, 8.2 yards per carry. But a lot of the regular names not quite showing up on the leaderboards quite yet. Christian McCaffrey is 22nd in the nation at 298 yards. He had a pretty big game this week for Stanford. And Leonard Fournette, he's now 26th in the nation in rushing, but Fournette has only played in 2 games. In week 1 against Wisconsin, he had 23 carries for 138 yards, 6 yards per carry. And this week against Mississippi State in a win, he had 28 carries for 147 yards, 5.3 yards per carry. And with all the hype around Lamar Jackson, while Leonard Fournette was sat out against Jacksonville State, we sort of forget the fact that here's a guy that was, the top recruit in the nation a couple years ago, had all the hype around him as being, one of the best recruits of this century, really. And last year rushed for 1,953 yards, 6.5 yards per carry, 22 touchdowns. If he was in the draft, I think, he definitely should have gone and would have gone ahead of Ezekiel Elliott. And going into the next draft next year, how high can he go? Or will, the fact, it's interesting because right now we're going to get to it later, but Ezekiel Elliott averaging 3.3 yards per carry for the Dallas Cowboys right now. And isn't that interesting? But, Fournette coming out with 2 strong games to open the season, didn't get the gimme game against Jacksonville State where he could have rushed for 250 yards on 10 carries. But, in 2 tough games, pulls out some really good yards. What are your thoughts on not just Leonard Fournette and the season that he's having, and where if you still have him as a solid top 5 pick, but the running back class as a whole, because we do have some injuries to go around and we have some other guys that have been quiet?
Leonard Fournette is a top 5 pick, nailed on, unless he gets a serious injury between now and next April. I personally would not trust any mock draft. And look, mock drafts at this time of year are ridiculous anyway. But if you were so inclined to read them, he has to be in the top 5. He has to be. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that he wouldn't be. I don't know what people are watching if they don't think that Leonard Fournette is a top 5 pick. He's a complete player. He is incredibly physical. He's got the size. He's got the character. He's a leader. He's a grown man. He will run away from people just as much as he will slam them to the turf. He had this fantastic stiff arm. If you go on Seahawks Draft Blog right now, you'll see the video of this fantastic stiff. The defender's just gone to him, kind of like he's just holding him there, trying to bring him down, and Leonard Fournette just destroys him and then just sprints past him. It's incredible. The guy is one of the single best draft prospects I've ever seen, and I've been doing the blog for 8 years now, and I don't think I've seen a player who looks as good as Leonard Fournette. And to imagine that he would not go in the top 5 after Zeke Elliott went 4th overall just last year, I don't understand that. I don't understand how anybody can. And I see these kind of opinions, Kenny, of at the start of the season that Dalvin Cook at Florida State was better than Leonard Fournette, and I just think, don't try too hard, fellas, to be contrarian. Don't try too hard to have a hot take on this draft. Dalvin Cook is not better than Leonard Fournette. It's a ridiculous thing to suggest. I mean, Dalvin Cook, by the way, has looked incredibly average in the first 3 weeks of the season. Leonard Fournette is going to be special, and if he's not special at the next level, then it's because of stuff that we couldn't possibly forecast. That whether it's going to be injuries, whether it's going to be that he just lands on a horrible team, I don't know. But he's destined for brilliance, and I would draft the guy if I didn't need a quarterback. Let's think of a team who's maybe drafted a quarterback, and for example, I'm struggling to think of one right now. But if there was a team that's just drafted a young quarterback and didn't need to take one with the first overall pick, they'd have a hard time passing on Leonard Fournette for me. I mean, unless they really, really, really wanted Myles Garrett, then
what would you do if you were the LA Rams? Because the Rams, despite just beating the Seahawks, looked awful in week 1 and could very well, have a 3-win season. So the LA Rams just drafted Jared Goff. The year before, they just drafted Todd Gurley. They have, Robert Quinn and Aaron Donald. I guess if you take Myles Garrett, now you're really talking about like an unbelievable front defensive line. And it seems like the Rams, if there's any a potential quintessential team to trade down, they'd be it. What would you do if you were the Rams?
Well, the Rams aren't going to have a first-round pick this year because they traded it for Goff.
Right.
And the Eagles are the same. They're in the same boat with that. I mean, just to sort of figure, if let's just say Cody Kessler, I mean, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but let's just say he has a fantastic season now for Cleveland, now that he's going to be starting for them. And they felt like, they didn't want Deshaun Kaiser, they didn't want Deshaun Watson. Then, a team like Cleveland, they couldn't go wrong with Leonard Fournette. I mean, you would have a tone-setting running back who could be the heart and soul of your franchise. Leonard Fournette is going to be, teams are going to look at this guy and they're going to see marketing potential. They're going to see a guy who has already been campaigning to support flood victims in Louisiana, I think it was. And, he just everything about him screams future star. And then you watch him play and you just think, just go and watch the Auburn game from last year. The guy is just incredible. And to think, we were talking about the mock draft earlier, to see someone like Juju Smith-Schuster, with all great respect to him, and Teez Tabor, who's had some character flags this year, to see those two going in front of Leonard Fournette, I can't fathom that. And, Leonard Fournette for me is a potential number 1 overall pick. And one thing, Kenny, just to final on this, people always ask me, who's the player you would trade up for? I always get asked this question about a month before the draft. Who would you trade up for? Who's the one guy that if you were the Seahawks, that you'd move up for? And I never really have an answer because there's never really anybody, that I think was worth trading up for, because the Seahawks have got a good roster. They're not chasing anything really. They never have a need to do it. But if the Seahawks spent 2 first-round picks getting Leonard Fournette, I would have no issue with that whatsoever, because the guy is that good. He is an incredible player.
Well, let me ask you then. We can play top pick roulette. If you were this team picking first next year, would you take the best quarterback? Would you take Myles Garrett, or would you take Leonard Fournette? If you were the San Francisco 49ers, what would you do?
I would take Leonard Fournette.
If you were the Cleveland Browns, what would you do?
I would take Leonard Fournette, and I would accept that it's a much more long-term project in Cleveland, and would take Fournette and see what the options are with my second pick.
The Tennessee Titans have Marcus Mariota. They just drafted Derrick Henry. They traded for DeMarco Murray. What would you do?
If I was the Titans, I'd probably consider taking Myles Garrett, because I think defensively they've got some issues there. And I think that they need a superstar on defense, and Myles Garrett is another special player.
This is just, I'm going off Walter Football's order here for whatever reason. The Atlanta Falcons have Matt Ryan, they have Tevin Coleman, they have Devonta Freeman. What would you do if you were the Falcons in that position?
I don't think they could go wrong because I think defensively they haven't got any real stars and they need one. So Myles Garrett could fit in there. And equally, if Dan Quinn's trying to create Seattle 2.0 in Atlanta, they need the physical tone setting running back. So I think either of those guys would be a good fit. And my personal preference, I mean, I just love Fournette, and I know that you're not a big fan, Kenny, and I respect your opinion completely on the whole running back thing. It's a legitimate point that you make and that the people make about taking running backs early. But I don't think we're talking about any old running back here. We're not talking about a player who is just another guy. We're talking about someone who could be as good as Adrian Peterson's been. And and when we're talking about players like that, I think that you have to consider them a special case, and that's how I would look at Leonard Fournette.
Well, I mean, the whole case is being as good as Adrian Peterson is. I realize you don't want to like miss out, and miss out on a good player for a bad player, or miss out on a great player for a good player. Adrian Peterson's a great player, a Hall of Fame running back, one of the best of all time, one of the top 10 running backs we've ever seen on this planet. Dude cannot get to a Super Bowl, can't get to the playoffs very often. It's not enough. It's not enough. It's not as important as, having a quarterback, having a pass rusher, being able to play the passing game. You have to play the passing game. Ezekiel Elliott, is not playing that well right now. And then, they had everything set up for the best offensive line in football to say that we got Ezekiel Elliott. This is going to be a slam dunk and we're going to go over it right now. There are no really exciting, there's very few exciting running backs in the NFL. It's not a running back league. And we see these teams over and over again succeed with undrafted running backs, third round running backs, second round running backs. You can get the first running back taken in the second round oftentimes. And it is interesting only because it's just, you can hit a home run with a running back, but only hit a home run individually, not for the team game. If you hit a home run with the quarterback, you're going to the Super Bowl. If you hit a home run with the pass rusher, you could have that defense. Even if you hit a home run with a safety or a cornerback, you could be having a top-notch defense. And, I look at the Minnesota Vikings right now, and they lost their quarterback. They lost their running back, Adrian Peterson. And I'm looking at their team right now, and I'm saying they might be better off with Sam Bradford, and they might be better off without Adrian Peterson because he wasn't playing that well. He may have hit the wall. And if you look at even the Buffalo Bills, that same year when they took Adrian Peterson, the Vikings did, the Buffalo Bills select Marshawn Lynch, also a guy that I think is a Hall of Famer, also a guy that did not work out in Buffalo. And it's like it's not really the move for me that, the reason that Leonard Fournette would be a great pick for the Seahawks in my mind would be that they've got everything else set up. If you're, another team out there, if you're the team picking in the top 5, you have to say to yourself, why am I here? What is my reason for being in this situation that I finished 4-12 last season? What was that reason? It was probably not the running back position, and fixing the running back position will probably not take you away from being a 4-12 team. Now, there are teams with luxuries, such as the Dallas Cowboys, that when they have Tony Romo, maybe they had that luxury to say that now we've got 5 great offensive linemen, and we've got a quarterback, and we've got Des Bryant, and if we put Ezekiel Elliott in there, we're going to have a really good offense. Though I still think that you could look at it and say, yeah, but you got a shitty defense, and you had, like you guys just said, me quoting and making up a fake paraphrase for the Dallas Cowboys, you had a great offensive line. You had a great quarterback. You had a great wide receiver. You even made Darren McFadden a 1,000-yard rusher last season, and Darren McFadden is garbage. So what exactly was the benefit to adding Ezekiel Elliott? I think that the benefit to drafting Leonard Fournette, if there is one for the Cleveland Browns, just as an example, is that they're just such a shitty team and a shitty organization that at least they'd be interesting to watch. And that's my justification. If there's going to be a justification for Cleveland taking Leonard Fournette, it should be that they have that other draft pick. If the Eagles dump it and end up dumping their season and giving them a good draft pick, then great. Now you have maybe a little bit more freedom. But even then, that same luxury of freedom, and I'm using air quotes right now, that the Cleveland Browns would use to take a running back and maybe a quarterback, or a running back and a pass rusher or a cornerback, is the same bullshit that got them into the same trouble with Justin Gilbert and Johnny Manziel and Trent Richardson and Brandon Weeden and all the other times that they thought that they could take one risk because they felt that they were safe in the other place, or that they could take two risks because two risks, maybe one of them would work out. And we're sitting here in 2016 and their last 7 first-round picks or something are like gone. And it's like, it just doesn't work for me to see so many examples of first-round running backs do jack shit for their teams. That as special as Leonard Fournette is, if he's as special as Adrian Peterson, I think that you would just get more out of hitting a home run at like 5 or 6 other positions. Even though I agree that the team that drafts Leonard Fournette is getting a hell of a player.
Yeah, I mean, just to offer a counter to that, I think first of all, the Cleveland Browns' problem has not been picking a particular position; it's picking the wrong guys. And also part of the issue that a lot of these teams have is that the Cleveland Browns need a structure. They need a 5-year plan, and they've been working on kind of 1 or 2 year plans for so long now. They have a different coach every year, different GM or whatever. Now, if you're looking at this as, right, okay, this is a 5-year plan to make the Cleveland Browns a contender. If you take Leonard Fournette 1 year, you might be saying, hey, we might be 4-12 again this year, but we'll have Leonard Fournette in a year's time, and maybe there'll be a quarterback who we really like, who's sat there waiting for us the number 1, number 2, number 3 overall pick in a year's time. The bad teams that continually, perennially struggle are the ones who are just so impatient. And if you look at the Seahawks, when Pete Carroll came in and John Schneider, they're the perfect example. They needed a quarterback in 2010, had 2 first-round picks, didn't take a quarterback because they didn't see one they liked. In 2011, they needed a quarterback, didn't take one because they didn't see one they liked. In 2012, they didn't take one in the first round, they didn't take one in the second round, they took one in the third round and let him compete with Matt Flynn and Tavares Jackson and found the guy that they liked. And sometimes, certain positions are more important, but this is a team-building exercise, and you can't build a team in 1 year. And if Cleveland Browns think that they're going to have a contender because they pick a quarterback first this year because it's more important, or they pick an offensive tackle because that's more important, that's not what's going to get them to be a good team. It's accumulating talent. On the whole Adrian Peterson thing, I would say that the Minnesota Vikings were 1 game away from the Super Bowl. They lost it in overtime to the New Orleans Saints in the NFC Championship. New Orleans went on and won the Super Bowl. If it wasn't for a bit of classic Brett Favre erraticism, they probably would have won that game and would have gone to a Super Bowl. I mean, Adrian Peterson could easily have had a Super Bowl title, and I think one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that Minnesota got that far was because of Adrian. And as for Marshawn Lynch, yes, he did not provide value for Buffalo, but let's just flip it around. Let's just envisage that rather than the Seahawks trade for Marshawn Lynch, they actually drafted him. Let's just pretend that they actually were the ones that drafted him in the top 15 that year. Well, Marshawn Lynch did more than anybody, really, to get the Seahawks into a position to be a contender. And I don't think that without Marshawn Lynch, they probably wouldn't have been as good as they were. I think that he would. Well, I know he was clearly a major impact in the Seahawks getting to where they got to. Now, the great thing the Seahawks did is that they put talent around him so that they could have a loaded roster in 2013. The one thing that the Minnesota Vikings have done is not do that. I mean, they've looked for stopgaps. So it was Tavares Jackson, the quarterback with Adrian Peterson. Then they go to Brett Favre on, a wing and a prayer. They move on from Favre. Who did they draft to be the quarterback of the future? Well, in a draft when, they could have had Andy Dalton, for example, in the second round, or Colin Kaepernick, and they could have had, guys like Muhammad Wilkerson or Cameron Jordan, players like that, or Robert Quinn in the first round. They take Christian Ponder. I mean, that's just a ridiculous pick. Christian Ponder was the pick after J.J. Watt. I mean, that's just put that into perspective there. They're 1 pick away from getting at J.J. Watt. They take Christian Ponder. There were better quarterbacks in that class, but they pushed they pushed the envelope too much. We need a quarterback. We're going to take one. We're going to reach for one, rather than just accumulating better talent and looking for the right areas. The following year, having taken Christian Ponder in the top 15, what a surprise! The Vikings are picking in the top 5. In a year which was widely regarded as the best quarterback class in a long time. They don't take a quarterback in that draft because they've already taken Christian Ponder. So, forget the quarterbacks that went in that draft, forget Russell Wilson, forget any of the other guys. They're not taking one because they've just taken Christian Ponder. For me, okay. It's not running backs that are the issue. It's team building that is the issue, and short-term thinking.
Okay, but I agree that Marshawn Lynch, was a key part of the Seahawks, winning the Super Bowl and being as successful as they were. But it's a false hypothesis to imagine a scenario in which he wasn't acquired for third round or fourth round draft picks. Because when you look around at the NFL, the whole point isn't necessarily whether or not running backs are important. It's about whether or not spending a good draft pick on one is a good idea, when you know that in free agency they're pretty much never retained, and if they're let to walk all the time because teams don't want to spend more than $7 million on a running back because they know how easy it is to acquire one, then the difference between the elite running back and the good running back is not that great in terms of value. When I look at these are the top 6 running backs in the NFL right now in terms of yardage after 2 weeks. D'Angelo Williams was not drafted by the Steelers. Matt Forte was not drafted by the Jets. Isaiah Crowell was not drafted by the Browns. He was an undrafted free agent. LeGarrette Blount was not drafted by the Patriots. Lamar Miller was not drafted by the Houston Texans. And C.J. Anderson was not drafted by the Denver Broncos. He was also an undrafted free agent. Then you get to Melvin Gordon and Ezekiel Elliott, and we know that Melvin Gordon didn't score any rushing touchdowns as a rookie. We know that Ezekiel Elliott is not having that great of a start to the season. Then you get to David Johnson, who was a third-round pick. DeMarco Murray was not drafted by the Titans. Spencer Ware was not drafted by the Chiefs. Christine Michael was let go by the Seahawks last year, and as well as 2 other teams. So I look at a lot of teams. I see LaShawn McCoy was not drafted by the Bills. I see Danny Woodhead was not drafted by the Chargers. So most of the running backs right now in the top 20 in rushing were not drafted by the team that has them. So if you're looking for a guy to accumulate you yards, I think it's foolish for the teams that did spend Melvin Gordon with San Diego, Ezekiel Elliott with Dallas, and Todd Gurley, who is 25th in rushing, 36 carries for 98 yards for the Rams this season. I think it's foolish to be spending top 15 picks on all 3 of those players when they don't have the same amount of production or value right now at this time as guys that were undrafted or traded for at low costs or signed in free agency for nominal amounts of cash. So if you add Leonard Fournette into that list, the expectation at that point is that in my opinion, the expectation at that point is he better be Jim Brown. He better be, so much more above all these other guys that it does justify such a high pick, because as it is tough for me to let go of the notion that spending a high pick on a running back is a bad idea, regardless of the player. He has to really be Marshall of Falk type is another guy. He has to be the whole tool. He has the whole offense.
I mean, this is how I would counter that, though. I mean, running backs are always going to get yards. I mean, the very nature of the position is, on a bad day, you'll get 60 yards. Getting a 1,000-yard season is not difficult to do. So we can look at stats and say, okay, this guy has got, C.J. Anderson got so many yards last year. I think it was something like 900 yards maybe or something like that. But here's the thing, if you're an opponent who is facing the Seahawks with Marshawn Lynch, who was a first-round pick, you're facing Marshawn Lynch, you are spending the entire week game planning around how you're going to stop Marshawn Lynch. And you may succeed, but the amount of attention that you're paying to stop Marshawn Lynch is going to create a mismatch somewhere else. It's exactly the same problem with Minnesota. And how are we going to stop Adrian Peterson? That is what they are asking themselves. And this is what it will be with Leonard Fournette. Teams will have to prepare to stop Leonard Fournette. They won't be able to just go in there and say, hey, this is the run defense. How do we stop this guy? Because he's that good. And that is the difference between the elite running backs and the guys who just put up the numbers.
Well, let me ask you though, and you would be an expert on this more so than me, as much more so than on the NFL. If that's the case, why isn't LSU a better team? Because they are not that great of a team, especially by LSU standards.
LSU have not been able to develop a quarterback since. Their handling of offensive talent has been ridiculous. The quarterback that they have starting at the moment is just incredibly poor. I mean, he's just woefully bad. If they had even, a Matt Flynn style game manager, undrafted free agent type who could just get them in and out of plays, not make mistakes, they would be a national championship contender. But they have Cam Cameron, who's the offensive coordinator there. And if you remember a few years ago, he had at his disposal Zach Mettenberger, who was a perfectly, strong-armed quarterback throw into Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry, and their offense was average. So they just do not do a good enough job working with the talent they've got. They don't know how to develop quarterbacks. They haven't got a quarterback on the roster right now, and that kills them. And if you see the Alabama game last year, they just dominated up front because their whole game plan was to stop the run game, just to put everybody in the box, stop it, because they knew that LSU couldn't throw on them. And the quarterback is that bad. He's been benched now by LSU. They've finally benched him, and they've put another guy in there who's not a great deal better. And that is the problem that LSU have. They just with a quarterback who just can't throw a basic pass. I mean, he really is that bad. I can't speak poorly enough of him. They just don't have a passing attack, and that is the problem. That is the thing that's going to ruin. Leonard Fournette will finish his career without a Heisman Trophy, and it's one of the great. It's one of the great disappointments, I think, of college football in recent years, because he's that good. He really, really is that good, and he's going to get the numbers and he's going to have everything, but he won't have a Heisman because his team have never been a proper contender because of the quarterback position and the way that they handle talent.
Well, I look forward to seeing him at the NFL level. I think just as much as you do, maybe not as much because it's, I know you have such high expectations, and but I do so much believe that he's a great player, and we'll see what happens. We want to wrap up the college football talk. I know that you had a certain running back from Arizona State that you wanted to talk about, and I want to hear about. So tell us about him.
There's a guy called Kalen Ballage. It's a great name, and he equaled an NCAA record a couple of weeks ago by scoring 8 touchdowns in a game. The last one was a terrific 60, 70-yard breakaway run. He is such a great guy. I mean, if you listen to any of his interviews, I mean, he's such a personable person. Very great, very good talker. Sounds like a leader. After he'd done this 8 touchdown performance, the video is on the blog somewhere. If you actually go and dig it out, if people are interested, his sort of on the field post game interview immediately afterwards, and he compliments his O-line. It's very humble, very down to earth. There's so much to like about this guy. Incredible character, physical, runs the ball well, great size. He's about 6'1" and 230 pounds. He's got speed. I really like him. Speaking to somebody on the blog who was a commentator who follows Arizona State, they say that he probably won't. He's a junior, but he might stick around for his senior year. So he might not be in the draft next year, but he is definitely somebody to keep an eye on. I'm going to be going to the Washington Arizona State game in November. So I will get a chance to watch him live if he plays in that game, if he's healthy. And I'm really looking forward to it. I just think he's such an interesting player. I do think there are some interesting running backs apart from Leonard Fournette in this class. I think it's people like him, Matt Days, one or two others, Nick Chubb. I don't think it's the Royce Freemans and the Dalvin Cooks. I don't think they're quite as interesting as the people like Days and like Ballage. But he's somebody, if you get a chance to watch Arizona State, certainly keep an eye on the big running back.
Well, it sounds like Kalen Ballage had 4 visits in 2014 coming out of Peyton, Colorado. And one of those visits, the University of Washington, they got an offer, but I guess decided to go to Arizona State. As you said, 2 weeks ago against Texas Tech, 13 carries, 137 yards, 7 touchdowns, and a receiving touchdown on top of that. Pretty amazing. And moving forward to the NFL, I think it's interesting to think about some of the young players right now in the NFL. I've touched on it briefly, but, this is just incredible. After 2 weeks, the leader in yards from scrimmage among running backs, Spencer Ware, he is 127 rushing yards, 177 receiving yards with Jamal Charles out. And to top that all off, he's got 1 more rushing yard than Kristen Michael. He is 1 year younger than Kristen Michael. Of course, the Seahawks drafted Spencer Ware. What are your thoughts on Spencer Ware? What did you think of him when he was in Seattle or when he was at LSU? And what do you think his future could contain, since he is only 25 years old? And since we know that the Kansas City Chiefs, they run a similar system offensively to the Seattle Seahawks. They've produced running backs like Priest Holmes and Larry Johnson and Jamal Charles, and they sort of have this penchant for, having these great running backs. What do you think of the future of Spencer Ware?
Yeah, I liked Spencer Ware when he came out, and he did look like a mini beast mode. you could definitely see with his running style, why the Seahawks liked him. And I think there was talk for a time that he might end up sort of working at fullback a little bit because they wanted to find a way to keep him on the roster. I think they I think they've kind of gone away from this now, but I can't remember do you remember the name of the Oakland fullback, Kenny? Can you remember his name? The
Marcel
guy's still
Reese.
there now. Yeah. So I think that he obviously came through with Tom Cable, and I think they have been looking for a fullback who can be a threat as a pass catcher and a runner as well. I think they've been looking for that. I think that's why we had the Derek Coleman experiment. I think it's why they were eager to move on from Michael Robinson and get Derek Coleman involved. I think we've seen Spencer Ware get a try out there. They've been sort of looking for players who can maybe sort of become that Reese style player for them. And it hasn't really worked, and they've kind of gone back to the sort of big hulking Will Tukuafu now. But Spencer Ware had the DUI, didn't he? I think he had the issue, and the Seahawks kind of were in a position where they were going to need to cut people, and I think that was probably an easy out for them, shall we say? An opportunity to move on and make a decision easier for them because he had the DUI. I think he had the DUI. I think I'm right in saying that.
Yeah.
At Kansas City, he like you say, fits like a glove for the scheme there. Really like what he's shown so far. Not entirely surprised, and it's yet another player who has left it just because to show how talented that those teams were for the Seahawks, 2 or 3 years ago, when you see guys like him and Ron Parker and others, playing so well across the league and starting for teams and being majorly productive. And these were guys that were on the, were on the cutting edge of the Seahawks roster, the cutting line of the Seahawks roster. They didn't quite make it. And, I've seen a lot of stupid things said this week, things about the Seahawks because they lost in LA, and a lot of negativity and a lot of overreaction. And, one of the things that I read was that Pete Carroll doesn't know how to develop talent. And then, when I read something like that, and then you look across at all the players the Seahawks have enhanced and have made better, and you see the players that are playing at other teams around the league, and you think, how could you possibly think that? I mean, the Seahawks, this will go down, whatever happens this year, whatever happens for the next 2 or 3 years, this will be a golden age of Seahawks football. And Pete Carroll is a legendary coach, a legendary developer of talent, and the performances of players like Spencer Ware show that, and show that the great quality of John Schneider's eye for talent as well.
Yeah, people are, unreasonable. Fans are unreasonable oftentimes, and they get emotional and reactionary to certain moments. I'm not worried about the Seahawks. Offensively, I think that they're only going to get better from here on out, and I think that defense is something that you cannot really expect to improve that much as the season goes on. I think it does happen. I think we saw it with the Houston Texans last year defensively, but I don't think that it's something that if you were in the beginning of the season, right now the Oakland Raiders are, like first in total offense and last in total defense. And the Seahawks are, first in total defense and points and scoring defense and 31st in points. And I would take that 100 times out of 100 because I think that you can work on an offense. You can work on a game plan. You can expect, I know that and we know physically with the Seahawks that Russell Wilson's been hampered since the middle of week 1 with an ankle injury. We know that, CJ Prosise has missed a game and a half with injuries, and he was supposed to play a huge role. We saw in the one catch that he made in week 1 against the Miami Dolphins was a conversion on 3rd and 13. That's what CJ Prosise is there to do. It's a huge difference when you don't have Thomas Rawls in the second half. That's a huge difference. And I know that, people can look at the numbers of Thomas Rawls at 7 rushes for -7 yards. But if you watch the game, you saw that he had no opportunities. And as soon as he was getting the ball, he was tackled. There was nothing that he could do. And I think, Jimmy Graham is starting to work his way into the offense more and more. Doug Baldwin was hurt in the second week. There's so many things offensively that I see improving. But on defense, we already know that they're playing amazing. This is a team that's great against the run, that's great against the pass, that Frank Clark has 3 sacks in 2 games. Frank Clark is coming into his own. We've seen Cassius Morris improve. We've seen him get better on defense. We've seen him get better on special teams. I'm seeing only we've seen Deshaun Shedd struggle in the second game, and maybe that's the biggest concern right now defensively is, where is Deshaun Shedd's head at from being so great in week 1 to being, not so great in week 2. But I'm not panicking for a team that's given up 1 touchdown in 2 games. I'm not panicking at all. And I would expect them to go in. I would expect them to win this week against the San Francisco 49ers to get to 2-1. And if they lose that game, I would be a billion times more concerned than I would be for them to lose in LA in front of 92,000 screaming fans in 90 plus degree heat in extremely weird conditions, given everything in 2 decades worth going into this game, the attention on the game, the injuries, the weather. There's so many, and the fact that it's the Rams, as Michael Robinson said after the game, they know something about Seattle. Jeff Fisher knows something and he's exploiting it. I would be, even though there is sort of an X factor with Chip Kelly and, the fact that he's doing things a little bit differently in San Francisco than they did last year with the horrible Jim Tomsula, as far as being a coach goes, I would be much more concerned with losing to them. And I would expect them to win to beat San Francisco at home. And then I would expect them, to go into New York Jets with Darrelle Revis playing like garbage this year, and hopefully pulling out a win. Though, again, if they lost that week, it wouldn't be the biggest concern to me in the world to lose on the East Coast. So that being said, definitely I'm not concerned about the Seahawks overall, and I think there's a lot that we can unpack positively about Seattle. What was your main takeaway from the game?
Well, I'll try and keep this short because I've got a lot to say, but I think first of all, the overreactions. I knew there was going to be some overreactions, but I didn't quite expect what I was reading. Not just on the blog, but on Twitter and on other websites as well. I don't understand where fans are coming from. If you want someone fired after that, when the team is playing with an injury list, which is incredible. The quarterback's playing with one leg. The right guard's injured. The replacement right guard was questionable going into the game. The tight end's coming back from a serious knee injury. One of the other tight ends is out. Nick Vannett is out and hasn't played a snap for the Seahawks yet. CJ Procise is out. Thomas Rawls gets injured during the game and goes out. Doug Baldwin got injured during the game and had to leave for a while. Tyler Lockett left for most of the game, and he took away your punt return guy as well, and only came back at the end, sucked it in, and got that big catch at the end, which almost helped the Seahawks win the game. There is no team in the NFL right now with the sheer number of injuries that the Seahawks have on offense to expect that the offense is going to function in anything like its best, given everything that's going on with the injuries right now. And considering that you're playing a team with possibly the greatest defensive player in the NFL, apart from J.J. Watt, playing defensive line for the Rams, not to mention the fact that Robert Quinn looked pretty good the other day, rushing off the edge, not to mention that they've got other talent there, like Alec Ogletree, who played probably one of the better games of his career so far. You could just run through. Everything was working against the Seahawks offense that day. And you know what? They were crap. They were really, really bad. They had a really, really crappy game. And it happens every now and again, you're going to get your asses kicked. And the Seahawks tend to get their asses kicked by the Rams more often than not. But to feel like the sky is falling because of that one. I know, right? Yeah, you know what? They struggled against Miami as well, but with all of the same injury issues, with the same tough opponent, the first week of the season, everybody looked like crap in the first week of the season. How many games were decided by a point or two in the first week of the season? This is just the NFL. This team, and I mean the players and the coaches and the front office and the owner should have enough money in the bank with everything they've achieved over the last 2 or 3 years that they can be afforded the odd off day. And this was just what this is. And the Seahawks are in a survival mode right now. They've just got to see through these injuries. They've just got to get healthy. They've got to try and win games while getting healthy. It's not easy to do when you're playing teams like the New York Jets coming up. And if they go to 2-2 at the bye, big deal. You get healthier during the bye, you come back, and then you do what the Seahawks always do, which is finish strong. This is a team that finished second overall in DVOA for offense last year, that set records in the passing game, that was obliterating everybody in the passing game. And that's without Marshawn Lynch and a few others and Jimmy Graham that were injured as well. To overreact to this one performance really bothered me. Now, in terms of what they need to do to improve, the problem they've got right now is that, and I don't think the offensive line performance was as bad as a lot of people have made out. It wasn't great, but it wasn't, they had 2 sacks. If anybody watched the Monday Night Football game, did they see Jay Cutler getting injured? Did they see Carson Wentz getting smashed in the face by one of the defensive linemen at Chicago? Every team in the league is giving up pressure right now, including the Dallas Cowboys, if you forgot that their quarterback's injured right now for the second time in 2 years. What the problem they've got is the offensive line is hurt and is missing Ifedi and has got a few issues there, and the quarterback can't move. Teams are teeing off on the running game. It's having an issue with the running game. Russell can't move around. I don't know about you, Kenny, but I think in spite of everything that was going on with injuries and situations like that on Sunday, if Russell Wilson had been 100%, I think the Seahawks win that game going away.
Yeah, I think there's numerous factors that give the Seattle a huge advantage. If it wasn't for injuries, just simply Jermaine Ifedi may have made the difference. Aaron Donald, trying to put him up against a hobbled Jamarcus Webb, I mean, it's ridiculous. There was so much that just changed everything for the running game, and we saw how much it changed their offensive game plan. And we don't know yet how good Ifedi will be during the regular season, but maybe that's enough of a difference. Like you said, Nick Vannett also being out, we don't know yet what kind of an impact he can have. But certainly, I think that, going back, today I went back and I watched the first half of the Miami Dolphins game, and there's just such a huge difference in the way that Russell Wilson can move. I mean, in that game, he's going up against Sue and Mario Williams, and like, having to make turns on a dime, and because he's scrambling, he has not a lot of protection. It requires a lot of scrambling. So like, being Russell Wilson, even at 75% on one ankle, it may not seem like a lot of a difference, but I think it's clearly making a difference. And yeah, I think it played a huge role in how he was able to do. But I think you still can go back and look at last season, and their record against teams that had elite defensive tackles was 1-5. So I think that's going to be an issue until they figure out a way to shore up the middle of the defensive line. Maybe that'll be a Ifedi. But we also need to see much better play from Justin Britt and Mark Lewinsky, because there's not just going to be one excuse for getting blown up like that. I was curious too, because there was a post on Reddit today of 4 plays where the Rams either could have been flagged for either hitting Russell Wilson low or hitting him in the head and the helmet. I also saw a play last week against the Miami Dolphins where Russell Wilson was pulled down by the face mask on 3rd and 9 in the red zone. He was pulled down on 3rd and 9 by the face mask. He was on the corner of the face mask. More egregious by far than if Cassius Marsh even had a face mask against the Rams. But it wasn't being protected that well. And I don't like ticky-tack fouls, but I am curious because of the Aaron Donald's week 1 dust up, and Aaron Donald was involved in 3 of these plays, either going low or going high on Russell Wilson. You've watched a lot of Aaron Donald. You've talked a lot about Aaron Donald. Do you think, I don't know if it's an attitude thing that people have to have if you're going to be a great defensive tackle. I don't know if you become a great defensive tackle, you start to get, sort of cocky or angry, or maybe you're just beastly out there and you get angry. But do you think that Aaron Donald is a dirty player?
No, I don't think he's a dirty player. I think he's the kind of player that if he played for your team, you'd love him, and if he doesn't play for your team, you make question marks like that. And I just think that going back to what I was saying, I just think that Russell Wilson, if he's 100%, he moves around, he takes over the game. I think he takes over the game in the second half. If he can scramble, I think he just scrambles away from the pressure. There was the one play where he tried to stiff arm Alec Ogletree when a healthy Russell Wilson probably just sprints into a big green patch of space for a massive first down. I think he would have scrambled around. I think he would have made all the throws. I think he would have destroyed LA in that second half. And I think it would have been a very, 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 very comfortable win for the Seahawks if Russell Wilson was healthy. I think that the fact that he can barely move and he's playing in a serious high ankle sprain is hamstringing the offense at the moment, and that's an issue. But they've just got to get through it. I mean, they've just got to find a way to win, at least one of the next 2, get into the bye, try and get him healthy, and try and get him back to anything like 100%. That injury is pretty serious, and I just think that to sort of overreact to this and feel like, well, the offense is no good, and Bevel, let's fire Bevel in mid-season, and is Pete Carroll doing a good enough job, and and asking all of these questions now, and sort of feeling like the sky is falling because the team has had a really, really rough outing, when it's pretty obvious why they had the rough outing, because of all of the injury issues that they had, in particular to Wilson. I'm not buying that. I'm fully convinced that as long as Wilson can get back to 100%, this team is going to be just fine. And I hope that he can get healthy as soon as possible. I fully expect the Seahawks to win this week against the 49ers. I think it will be tough to win in New York. I'm not confident about that game, But if it's 2-2 going into the bye, and if you could tell me that off the back of the bye, Russell Wilson could be 90% or 95% or 100%, I'll take that every day of the week, because this team has got a lot more to prove. It's going to get healthier, it's going to get better, and it's not going to be decided because of one off day and a crappy performance in Los Angeles in week 2.
And, it's just interesting. I mean, the Seahawks have given up 19 points this season. 23 teams have given up at least twice that, most of them considerably more than twice that. And I realize the Seahawks have also scored 15 points. So there's the double side of the coin. But obviously, like we've been talking about, the amount that's going against them offensively, and the fact that they're going up against teams that have pretty much their Achilles heel. They're not going to go up against the Rams and the Dolphins every week. I think we'll see immediately this week, I think we'll see an improvement against the 49ers in terms of Seattle's offense. And going up against Blaine Gabbert, hopefully then we see a continuation of their strong play on defense. Overall in the NFL, the Patriots, the Ravens, the Steelers, the Texans, the Broncos, the Vikings, the Giants, and the Eagles are 2-0. Of those 2-0 teams, what would you say is like the most surprising, and which do you think is out of those teams isn't really that strong? Might be the weakest playoff contender.
Of the 2-0 teams, I think that Philadelphia and New York are a bit of a paper tiger. If you were facing either of those teams in the playoffs, I think you'd be saying, yeah, great, that's perfectly good. And one of those teams probably will make the playoffs because of the way the NFC East is, and that'd be a good season for them, and everyone would say they've done well, and people are talking about how great Carson Wentz is today. But I don't think that either will be a threat once it gets to the postseason. I think that one of the weaker 2-0 teams is probably Baltimore. They're playing tough. I think you have to give them a lot of credit for being 2-0, but they very nearly blew that game against Cleveland. They weren't particularly convincing in their first game. This is a pretty easy start for them, and I think once they play Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, we'll find out just how good they are. I think Denver will actually come back to the pack a little bit. I know that they're 2-0, but again, they're relying so much on the defense, and unlike the Seahawks, who can, hopefully down the line get an elite quarterback back to full health, they've got Trevor Siemian, and when it comes to Trevor needing to win a game for the Broncos, that is when we're going to find out just how good they are. I thought Minnesota looked pretty good the other day, but I'm still not entirely sold on them. Peterson's got an injury now. Can Sam Bradford play at that level for more than 1 week? I'm not too sure. Green Bay are not the best travelers either. So, I mean, of the group, the biggest pretender might be Baltimore at the moment, but I don't know. I think that maybe when the buzz of Philadelphia dies down a little bit, they might be the one to single out, though.
Also, the Indianapolis Colts have given up almost 4 times as many points as the Seahawks. They've given up 73 points, the most in the NFL. Andrew Luck played well in week 1, not so well in week 2. They're 0-2. I'm curious too. Do you think that the Indianapolis Colts, you got the Colts and you got the Jaguars, and the Jaguars have been outscored by 28 points. And Khan has put so much confidence in Gus Bradley. What are your thoughts on on those two teams in the AFC South, the Colts and the Jaguars? Do you think the Colts, as bad as their defense is, could be a contender for the number 1 overall pick?
I think they're both horrible. And, I watched the Colts play in preseason and they just look like an absolute shambles. And, they have a defensive-minded head coach, and the defense is a total joke. I mean, if you take Andrew Luck out of that team for the last few years, what are they? Probably still a number 1, number 2 overall pick kind of contender. And, I think you give Luck, I think Luck's early achievements now as a rookie in his first 2 or 3 years in the league look even better than they did at the time, because, just they're an absolute joke of a team right now. And this is a team, by the way, that was their GM was awarded GM of the year in the year that the Seahawks were starting to grow under John Schneider. So they got Ryan Grigson got a new contract, Trick Pagano got a new contract, and I would not be surprised at all if they are not in Indianapolis, making their big decisions for Indianapolis in a year's time. As for Gus, the Jaguars, it just isn't coming together for them. They've had a number of years now of accumulating talent, but I always felt like they're a team that looked better on paper than they actually are. And they're the kind of team that, they could turn up and play, I don't know, they could play the Cardinals, for example, on the road and beat the Cardinals, and everyone would be like, oh wow, they've beaten the Cardinals, and then you'll talk about how great they are for a week and how they're a developing team, and then the week later they probably lose to the Cleveland Browns at home. That's exactly who the Jaguars are right now, and unfortunately for Gus Bradley and for Dan Quinn, I think that they've benefited from the brilliance of Pete Carroll. And I think that the fact that they have struggled as head coaches so far, and I don't feel particularly optimistic about Gus Bradley's future in Jacksonville. I think it just once again goes to prove that there is, you can have a coaching tree, you can have influence, you can try and mimic it. I mean, Dan Quinn talks a lot like Pete Carroll in his press conferences and his tweets, and he talks about, competing all the time, but they're not Pete Carroll, and nobody is. So I mean, it just goes to show that the Seahawks have got one of the best head coaches probably that has been in the modern era of the game, and it's good for them.
I think that it's interesting this year, especially you could look at, is this when, Pete Carroll starts his coaching tree, as it were, starts to fall apart in the same way that Bill Belichick's has in the past, because, Gus Bradley is back on the hot seat with an 0-2 start, with the Jaguars looking terrible. The Falcons don't look that great, and the Raiders have the worst defense in the NFL underneath Ken Norton Jr. Looking at that Falcons team as well, it's interesting because it brings me back, or brings me around to the NFL draft and Jameis Winston, the number 1 pick in 2015. I've never quite seen such a dichotomy of performances in back-to-back weeks. Week 1, Jameis Winston has 71% completions, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, and 8.78 yards per attempt, and 9.88 adjusted yards per attempt against the Falcons, with Dan Quinn's defense. This week against the Arizona Cardinals, he completes 51% of his passes with 1 touchdown and 4 interceptions, 4.67 yards per attempt, and 1.6 adjusted yards per attempt. One of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, if not the worst this week, playing as bad as Case Keenum, if not worse than when he did the week before. What do you make of Jameis Winston in these 2 performances?
I thought it was strange because I kind of expected Tampa Bay to give Arizona a really big game this week, and it was tight early on. I think all of the points came in the second quarter. I think it was scoreless after the first quarter, and it was weird because Tampa Bay's defense was just poor, really poor, and once Arizona started to put up the points, you wanted to see Tampa Bay respond, and you thought, well, it's going to be this type of game. They're going to have to match Arizona score for score, and Winston just couldn't do it. I mean, he was erratic. His throws were all over the place. He turned the ball over. And he looked last week like a player that was developing towards being in the second group of quarterbacks, that had that kind of potential. And on Sunday, he looked like a quarterback who's still a couple of years away from being at his very best. And he's going to need to get rid of those types of performances. He has to be. If this is the way the Bucs are going to be, I'm afraid. They've made their bed with they've got a very offensive-minded head coach now. Defensively, they don't have a load of talent. They've got Gerald McCoy and a few supporting pieces, but not a major loaded defense. So it's going to put pressure on Winston to keep up with quarterbacks like Carson Palmer. And at the moment, he's just not ready to do that. And I think that they've got a lot of growing still to do. They're probably 2 drafts away from being a team that can legitimately contend.
We'll wrap it up here with maybe talk about a couple more NFL notes. Just looking around at the other quarterbacks, and it is interesting to just sort of see maybe who's playing well and who isn't playing well, and it's only 2 games. So you never know. Like, we've seen in past seasons, guys look amazing through 2 games, 5 games, 6 games, and then, fall apart, and maybe in the opposite effect as well. It certainly seems like the Washington Redskins did the right thing by not giving Kirk Cousins a long-term deal, something that a lot of other teams weren't able to get away from. Although the Washington Redskins are 0-2, maybe they've done one thing right and not, giving Kirk Cousins a long-term contract, putting him on the franchise tag, as he has, 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions, a passer rating of 78.5. But then the top contender, Matt Ryan, we talked about the Atlanta Falcons. He's completing, 72% of his passes, but 10 yards per attempt, 73 throws for 738 yards. He leads the NFL in passer rating. Sam Bradford's debut in Minnesota, very good. Despite just getting over there 2 weeks ago. Phillip Rivers, Jimmy Garoppolo, the performance that he had, and the sprained AC joint, they're saying that he's a maybe for Thursday, so maybe it's not as bad as initially feared. Though who really knows for sure what's going to happen there, is they could start Jacoby Brissett. What are your thoughts on Jimmy Garoppolo's first 2 weeks? What does that mean for the Patriots moving forward? Based on what they've seen or what you've seen in Jimmy Garoppolo's first 2 weeks. And if Jacoby Brissett has to play, what were your thoughts on Brissett going into the draft?
Well, I thought Garoppolo looked really good. And, I think it's a real shame for him, because if he'd have played really well in these 4 games, then New England would have been put in a real tough bind, because I don't think they would have wanted him to walk. I think his contract is coming up soon. So, it may even be at the end of this season. So they need to make a decision on him, because Tom Brady's 39, and they've drafted quarterbacks in that range. They took Ryan Mallett, for example. There's 1 or 2 others they've had there. And because Brady's just kept going and going and going, those players have moved on, and they've drafted another one. I just think that Garoppolo has shown enough now to warrant some serious consideration of signing him and keeping him, and almost like an Aaron Rodgers style project, so that when Brett Favre was at Green Bay, eventually you move on and Garoppolo comes in and just carries on and keeps up the great passing game. And I think he looked really, really good. And it's a shame. And I don't want to see the Patriots do particularly well, but watching him play, I think it was a shame for the guy that we're now going to be robbed of seeing him on Thursday. We're going to be robbed of seeing him over the next couple of games too. I do think the Patriots have got a tough decision to make, because Brady, we saw with Peyton Manning, eventually what will happen is the play will just fall off a cliff. We can't keep going and going and going forever. And Garoppolo looks smart. So you just wonder, in the off season, do you think about, what can you get for Tom Brady? Do you have that conversation if you really believe in Garoppolo? Is a 40-year-old Tom Brady an asset you can move and then just move forward for the next 10 years with Garoppolo? I don't know. It'd be controversial, but it's something that Green Bay had to do. Favre didn't want to leave. He went to Minnesota after that, and then went on to they went to the Jets first, I think, didn't he? And then he went to Minnesota, I think. So, Green Bay made a difficult decision, but it paid off, because Aaron Rodgers won him a Super Bowl. Do New England have to make a similar decision? That's something that they will have to consider. As for Jacoby Brissett, I liked him. I really liked him. I thought he was decent at NC State. I don't think he progressed to the extent that we were all hoping for. He never quite got up towards that potential first-round pick that he could have been. But he had some nice games. He moved around. He threw the ball nicely. And I think they're going to sort of really dumb down the playbook for him and the game plan, because they're going to have to. And I think they're playing the Texans on Thursday, so that's a baptism of fire. Welcome to the NFL. You get to play J.J. Watt in your first start. But it will be interesting to see if he can just manage the situation, and if they can at least win one of these next couple of games, because then when Brady gets back, he gets a nice big fat W against the Cleveland Browns to start up in week 5.
Last question. It is something that affects the Seahawks both head to head and, in the NFC picture overall. Aaron Rodgers is not playing well, and he has not played well since the beginning of last season. This is a guy who's 33 years old, so not old. This is a guy that up until then, up until last season, was one of the greatest quarterbacks, if not in contention when it's all was saying and done, of being the greatest quarterback of all time. Steve Young type numbers, leading the NFL in passer rating, many times, and constantly just doing things that, other quarterbacks could not do. And, as you just alluded to, the fact that they turned to Aaron Rodgers, and yeah, he had 31 touchdowns and 8 interceptions last year, and that was pretty much his average from 2008 to 2015. He went 80 and 39 over that period of time, averaged 8 yards per attempt, which is difficult to do in a season, let alone over 119 starts. But when you really break it down, his yards per attempt has taken a nosedive. He was at 8.4 yards per attempt in 2014. That went down to 6.7 yards per attempt in 2015, and it's now at 5.9 yards per attempt. He has a passer rating of 82.6. He's completing just 57% of his passes, and he's not old. We don't know of any injuries. Jordy Nelson is back. You can't lean on that excuse. I think the Green Bay Packers, I wrote about it in the summer. I think they've done a horrible job at drafting over the last 5 or 6 seasons. They've not reloaded as they tell everyone that they're doing and that they're good at. They're not that good at doing it. They cut Josh Sitton. They've basically put themselves in a bind now of losing to the Minnesota Vikings this week, and finding themselves at 1-1 and not having that good of a roster. But is Aaron Rodgers, can he really put the blame on his roster, or is this sort of a sharp decline in Rodgers' career coming 5 or 6 years before we thought it would? What are your thoughts on Rodgers?
And I have to say, I mean, I've not seen the whole of the 2 games they've played. I watched the Minnesota game until the end of the third quarter, and I thought he'd been fairly good in that game up until that point. And then in the Jacksonville game, I only saw it on Red Zone, so I mean the only plays I was seeing really were the big plays. So there was one throw where he was actually like he was in the process of being sacked, and as he was just about to hit the turf, he threw this insane pass to Jordy Nelson, who caught it, and it was just one of the best, touchdowns I think we're going to see all season, even in week 1. So I'm not sure. I can't really comment if he's played badly in the snaps I've not seen. Then fair enough. But I can only say that I've seen good things from Rodgers so far. I think from the Green Bay situation is when you look back at the year when they won the Super Bowl in the 2010 season, they won the Super Bowl that year. They've lost a lot of players that were, the Pro Bowlers that they had in that campaign were people like Greg Jennings, Chad Clifton, Clay Matthews, Charles Woodson, Tramon Williams, Nick Collins. Aaron Rodgers wasn't a Pro Bowler. I don't think he was named to the Pro Bowl that year. So, the supporting cast that he did have around him, they've mainly gone. People like Clay Matthews, who were really effective in 2010, are kind of old and slow now. Jordy Nelson is 31. He's kind of feels like he's. I just looked that up and I thought he's going to be like 27, 28. But he's actually been around a long time. I mean, he's going to be 32 next May. And he's coming off a serious injury. And then you kind of look at some of the other players as Randall Cobb, he's flattered to deceive a little bit. Devontae Adams isn't that great. They've not had a great tight end there for a long time. The offensive line is decent, I guess you could say, but the running game's poor. Eddie Lacy's kind of eating himself out of the league. He does not look like he's lost a load of weight like the team has claimed. Defensively, they don't have a lot of stars. I think you're right that they've drafted poorly, and I just... because of Rodgers and because they do have some good players, that they'll be in games and they'll win games and they'll look really good in some weeks, and they'll probably win 12 games at least or something like that because the schedule's terrible. But then they will come up against tough opponents on the road, i.e. Minnesota, and just get their asses kicked. And they won't be able to match the physicality, or they will come up against a creative offense and they won't know what to do. I mean, it's one of the frustrating things about the Seahawks is that the last 2 times Seattle's played Green Bay, they've been extremely conservative on offense. And yet, you just watch Kaepernick and the way that he destroyed that defense when he was at San Francisco, and you watch the way that the Seahawks destroyed Green Bay in the in the game they had, the first game in the 2014 season, which was the season opener on the Thursday night. The Green Bay had no answer for the Seahawks offense. So if you're creative, you can trouble them. And I just, they'll be a contender as long as Aaron Rodgers can take them as far as he can. And they nearly had pulled off a miracle against Arizona to get to the NFC Championship game last year. But they don't have the complete roster that they maybe had in 2010, and they will not be ahead of teams like Carolina, Arizona, and Seattle in the pecking order in terms of favorites for the Super Bowl, I imagine.
Yeah, and just as a reminder of how good Aaron Rodgers was at the height of his career. I mean, you talked about the 2010 season and then coming back that 2011 season. It's easy to forget that after they won the Super Bowl, they went 15-1 the next year. They lost in the first round of the playoffs to the eventual champion New York Giants, but they went 15-1 that year. And Aaron Rodgers, I mean, arguably the greatest season of all time. That season he threw a touchdown on 9% of his attempts, meaning about 1 in 11 throws was a touchdown. He had 45 touchdowns. He averaged 9.2 yards per attempt. He had a passer rating of 122.5. Up until a certain point in that season, he had gone 12 straight games. His first 12 games of that season, he had a passer rating over 106. He was impeccable. He was perfect. He was the greatest quarterback of all time. He followed that up with, a few more really great seasons that, few few other quarterbacks have ever touched or will ever touch. Though I think that it is interesting now. When you look at statistically, we've seen like guys like Dan Marino, for example, start high and then sort of lull for the last 10 years of their career. We don't know what the future will bring for Aaron Rodgers, but for right now, the Green Bay Packers definitely, as opposed to, the way they looked a couple of years ago, do not look, I wouldn't say they look juggernaut Sheehan. So it's like they're definitely beatable. And, the Minnesota Vikings might actually repeat, even with the loss of Teddy Bridgewater. Who would have thought the loss of Teddy Bridgewater, the loss of Adrian Peterson? You look at that defense, the way that they have handled quarterbacks this first 2 weeks has been pretty incredible. And they've really done a good job these first 2 weeks to get to 2-0. Stephon Diggs leading the NFL by a good margin in receiving yardage as well. So that'll be interesting to watch. That's it for this week's episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. We came to you this week, a little bit of a Seahawks recap looped in there as well. Not that we don't usually talk about the Seahawks, so you can listen to 3000 NFL Mock Draft for that. We're always going to be Seahawks-centric. Or you can just listen for the college football. We talked about Lamar Jackson. We'll follow up with, his play as well as the play of Leonard Fournette and everyone else around the NCAA of note. Next week, we'll see what happens there. So you're going to have to tune in next Monday or Tuesday. We'll see. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Go to FieldGoals.com. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. I'm at Field Goals, and I'm at Kenneth Arthur S. So there's two things there. And any questions maybe you have or whatever, you can throw them on the blogs, and we'll try and address that. I think that, feel positive thoughts about the Seahawks. You shouldn't feel negative about a team that's, I think that there's just varying levels of, there's teams that are fans of the Browns I think that percentage-wise, just as many people find happiness with the Browns because they have such low expectations that a Corey Coleman touchdown might feel as good as a Seahawks win. It's just all about where you manage your expectations. So, think about the fact that the Seahawks have a great defense and have provided so many wins over the last 4 years under Pete Carroll, and sort of trust the process moving forward that, that things will get better, that they've got a lot of guys that should be getting healthier, that they've got a lot of talented players. You got a lot of exciting players that'll do historic things. So not to worry about the Seahawks. Hopefully they go in and they get a win against San Francisco 49ers this week and then come back next week for the next episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Thanks for listening.